My name is Saima, and it is my absolute pleasure today to welcome Malavika Bambawale to talk about climate change and the role played by public and private sector. Malavika is the managing director of Angie Impact, which is an advisory arm for one of the largest clean energy producers. Without further ado, Malavika, over to you. Thank you so much for joining us. And thank you for everyone else for joining us on Saturday. I know it's a very special time as you're joining on a weekend. So thanks again, and over to you, Malavika.
Thanks so much, Saima, and thanks UWC for this opportunity. Hi, everyone. I hope you can hear me well. Super excited to have the chance to talk to you about climate change today. It's a really hot topic these days, I guess, pun intended. There's a lot. It's a very complex topic as well, and how do we address this topic is one of the key challenges of today's time. A quick introduction to myself. I'm actually a UWC parent. I have 2 kids in East, in middle and high school, so special attachment there. But also I've spent over 20 years on this in the industry on this topic across 3 continents. So I worked in the US, I worked in Europe, and in APAC. And I've also worked across 3 different sectors. So I worked primarily in the private sector, but I've also worked, served the public sector, served governments, and I've worked with the development sector as well. So I kind of see this problem from all those different lenses, and I hope my perspectives will be helpful to you. What I want to talk to you today about is the importance of this topic. Hang on, let me just minimize this window here. Just firstly, for us to get on the same page on what we mean by climate change. Before I jump into, why is the private sector interested in climate change, and how do you divide the roles between the public and the private sector? And then just quickly about what actions are being taken and what are some of the challenges being faced. And I believe that after this session, there's a networking platform where you can ask me questions, and we can, we can interact and network as well. So let's get straight into it. So first, I don't think, I don't know what the audience is like and how familiar they are with the topic, but I thought I'll just start with one very basic question, which is often asked, which is, is climate change, first of all, what is the greenhouse gas effect? And isn't that something that is normally dealt with in the course of the Earth's, evolution? And secondly, do humans really have a role to play in the climate change? Now, I want to start by saying, yes, I mean, climate change is a long-term problem of the environment that has been caused by widespread human activity. And the greenhouse gas effect is something that exists in the sense that, Earth's natural breathing emits carbon dioxide, which is reabsorbed by vegetation, by the oceans, etc. But what has happened over the last 200 years since the Industrial Revolution, that natural pattern has been disturbed because of the way the population has grown really fast and because of human activity. And that absorption hasn't happened at the rate that is required to keep the global temperatures in check. And so the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere has increased by about 14%, which is leading to higher concentrations, which is called the warming effect. This is way more than has been seen over the last 4 million years. And this has caused this disturbance in our atmosphere and the rise of global temperatures. And everything you see related to, whether it's animals, whether it's, it's all caused by human activity. So our own consumption, where is this coming from? So if you look at where these emissions are coming from, about 75 or 3/4 of this is coming from fossil fuel consumption. So we are consuming and emitting, through activities such as electricity and heat, transportation, manufacturing and construction, buildings, etc. All of that constitutes for about 3/4 of this greenhouse gas emitted in the atmosphere. And then the rest of it, primary big chunk of that is coming from agriculture. So our own consumption of, the way land use is used, agricultural practices, including our consumption patterns, etc. So that's just to put us in the perspective of what climate change is and what are the main drivers. And of course, I think we also understand now there's a lot of information on what the consequences are of increased global temperatures. And here's a chart that explains how a 1.5 degree rise versus a 2 degree rise can have quite devastating effects on our environment. You have the permafrost melt across, on almost 1/3 of the land, but you also have water stress, which exposes, given the right type of temperature, either a quarter billion or 500 million people to water shortages, ecosystem changes, massive changes in biodiversity, and flood risks increasing by 2 to 3 times, just in the coming years. So I just want to jump straight into, what are we doing about it and what can we do about it? I mean, since this is a school platform, I thought I'll start with a little bit of economic theory. Milton Friedman, as you know, wrote a book called Capitalism and Freedom in 1962. And he said that the role of business was to use its resources and engage in activities designed to increase its profits. So very clearly, I mean, that was a sort of a very black and white view of what the private sector should be doing, increasing profits, and then it's the role of others to sort of manage other things. However, that view has constantly evolved over time. I mean, the economist Hardin actually wrote in his book later in the same decade that the tragedy of the commons stands for the dilemma in which multiple individuals acting independently in their own self-interest can ultimately destroy a shared resource. And that's what we've been seeing, that unfortunately these resources that come without a price tag, which are often common or public goods, get depleted very quickly, and that's what is leading, for example, to climate change. And climate change is not the only problem that we are facing on the environmental side. There's water shortages, there's biodiversity, there's plastics in the ocean. There are many other problems, but this one is what I'm going to be focusing on today. Further down, there was also the Brundtland Commission that was set up by the UN in 1983 that also wrote a report, and I like this quote very much, which sort of puts this whole sustainability by the private sector in a framework, right? It says sustainable development is development that meets the needs of our present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their needs. So I think that's a very nice way of putting it. But having said that, and given that we are operating in a capitalist environment, how does that practically change the way that companies behave today, right? I mean, what is causing, because at the end of the day, the key metric that companies are measured on is their return to shareholders. But what is happening is that there are different forces that are kind of putting the companies in a bit of a pressure cooker situation. So first of all, there's the public sector. So you have forums like the Paris 2015, the COP21 meeting that took place 6-7 years ago. And you have the UN Sustainable Goals and the frameworks that have been put together by multilateral organizations, but also governments that have signed up to these agreements to say, you know what, there's action that needs to be taken. This is a serious issue. And you also have investors that have been putting pressure on companies. And here I have a quote from Larry Fink of BlackRock, talks about how they are asking companies to disclose a plan for how their business model will be compatible with the net zero economy. And on that side, it's not just the investors, but also shareholders of companies that are sort of starting to put pressure. And I think a recent example of activist shareholders who put McDonald's and said, McDonald's, how are you treating your pregnant pigs? And we need to know what's happening with there. I mean, so that's an example of how shareholder activism is becoming more and more common. And then finally, you have customers who are also voting with their dollars. And I don't have data here, but I would just like to say there's sort of two types of customers. There are some that are rich and some that are not so rich, but with different levels of ability to vote with their dollar. And that is putting pressure on companies as well to be responsible and to be able to answer how their products are made and what impact they have on the environment. So moving on to the next slide, what are the established frameworks that the private sector is starting to use a lot? I mean, the first and the most well-known is ESG, and I'm sure again all of you have heard of this: environmental, social, and governance as the 3 pillars of sustainability. And then the second is also the SDGs. So a lot of companies are starting to provide reports on how their actions are impacting and which of the goals of the UN SDGs they align with, in their annual reports, for example. So let me go a little bit deeper now into what these actions are. What are the actions that the public sector is taking, and what are the actions that the private sector is taking? So first of all, just a quick recap of what happened with the Paris Agreement in 2015. Now, this was a bit of a wake-up call on the need to decarbonize now. Before that, it was the IPCC and the UN who were putting out reports saying, 2020 is going to be the watershed year by which we have to do X, Y, and Z. But not a lot of attention was paid. And I think Paris kind of created that wake-up call. It was signed by, it was the first legally binding global agreement to limit climate change. And 190 parties signed the agreement, which was really incredible. And what it does is, of course, there was a lot of controversy around, how exactly it's going to be implemented, and even some of the phrases, even today, like Article 6, etc., still being drafted. But it created that framework to limit our warming to well below 2 degrees, with the aim to limit the rise to 1.5 degrees. Now, what is this 1.5? What does this 2 mean, right? So there's a little bit of a chart on the left which shows you that we are currently close, between 2000 and 2020, and we are moving up in terms of our temperature changes. As you can see, the blue line is steadily in a straight up direction. What happens is, if we continue down this business as usual trajectory, we're going to hit 1.5 degrees warming in the next about 15 years or so, very quickly. And the idea is that if we can cap that, if we can actually turn the trajectory around and cap it, then we should try and do that, because the faster you take action on climate change, the better it is, and the less the damage that is caused. So the idea is to, realistically, we'll probably exceed 1.5. We'll get to 2 degrees. So let's try and cap this to 2 degrees, sign the legal binding agreement there, but then let's try and aim for 1.5 degrees. Now, what exactly is happening? Like, what is everyone doing? So we've signed these legal agreements, but what's happening with countries? What's happening with the companies, right? So, so far, about 83 countries, which is more than 3/4, who represent more than 3/4 of global emissions, have set long-term net zero carbon targets. So you have everyone, including the US, the EU, China, the 3 biggest emitters, India as well, who have signed up to create a net zero in varying degrees of time. Secondly, what is interesting is that you also have cities. A lot of cities who act sort of as independent jurisdictions have also signed up for these targets. So you have, it was a small number of 40 cities in 2010 that signed up independently, and now that number has reached over 1,000 this year. But then you also have companies who are putting in place science-based targets. So I'll talk a little bit about what science-based targets mean and what companies are doing. But there's, approximately 3,000, so about 2,884 companies that have signed up to create science-based reductions or science-based net zero targets. Now, before I go into what these guys are doing, each of them are doing, what I want to say is that, interestingly, despite all of these plans, our GHG emissions are projected to still increase by 14% by 2030. And if you recall, I was saying that if we want to get to 1.5, we have to halve emissions by 2030 over the next 8 years. So all of this is great, but it's still far from enough in terms of what is needed. So now going into what countries are doing, right? So I talked about these 83 countries that have signed up for net zero targets, and there's various levels of plans that are being put in place in our own, in our own region. Singapore doesn't yet have a net zero target, but Singapore is on its way. Singapore has created a carbon price, which has very ambitiously actually raised now, and it will probably hit $50 by the end of this decade, which is quite impressive. But you also have Indonesia, for example, that has said no coal by 2050. We also have Thailand, you have Vietnam, so a lot of countries are starting to move in this direction. But this is a chart. I mean, I don't want anyone to read through the font size too, but basically what this is saying is that there's a bunch of mandatory carbon markets and jurisdictions around the world that are developing, and over 40 countries and about 20 cities are covered by carbon pricing mechanisms. And this could be either carbon tax or an emissions trading scheme. There are 2 different types of mechanisms, one that caps the price, one that caps volume. And there's been an upward surge of carbon prices, thanks to all this action. And there's also about, I think this covers about 20 to 30% of global greenhouse gas emissions. Now, what's the private sector doing, right? So private sector you've heard of all these voluntary carbon. So that was the mandatory carbon side. There's also a voluntary carbon market developing. I mean, what the private sector is starting to do first and foremost is measure and report. And I'll show you, I mean, there's a huge complexity of measurement reporting frameworks. But then the second action that the private sector is doing is sort of incorporating this whole thinking into their business model. How do we, I think it's increasingly becoming clear to the private sector that it's harder and harder to make money if you're not compliant with what your investors want, what your customers want, and where the government is headed. So it makes business sense to be climate active. And that's where a lot of the big businesses are headed. They're starting to create internal carbon prices. They're starting to convince stakeholders. They're starting to push and appear in voluntary carbon markets, for example. And then finally, so all of that is good. It's all about planning and all of that. But then the big gap is also between the plans and the actions. And finally, we are seeing also action on decarbonizing, right? So first of all, this is just a snapshot and not meant for anyone to read this, but what I wanted to show is that just in terms of measuring and reporting, it's not a simple task to measure what carbon footprints are. There's a lot of different standards out there, a lot of different reporting frameworks out there, sometimes a lot of confusion, and people really need help, a lot of technical expertise to be able to do this properly. You have GRI, CDP, SASB, and now TCFD. And the way the standards are typically evolving is that the earlier standards, used to be very much focused on the measurement of the problem. And the new standards are also starting to incorporate, like TCFD, which is Climate Task Force on Climate Financial Disclosures. It's about what are the risks from climate change and how are you capturing that in your balance sheet. So there's a transition that's happening on the standard side of things. I also wanted to briefly talk about the science-based target initiative, which some of you may have heard of, which is a really it's becoming the most popular way for companies to set targets. Because what was happening was that, in the last sort of maybe 2-3 years ago, companies were starting to put their hand up and say, you know what, I'm going to be carbon neutral, or I'm going to be net zero. And there wasn't a common standard that defined what that meant. What does that term mean? And what are you promising? And is that even credible? So the Science-Based Target Initiative, SVTI, was a welcome kind of initiative set up by the CDP and WRI and the UN, a couple of different bodies coming together, and strongly represented by the private sector, by the industry, which is fantastic, which provides a credible, standardized framework for organizations to set their decarbonization goals, right? So it says, here's what, if you want to promise something, here's what you have to do. You sign up for SVTI, and then these are the steps you have to follow, and then we'll figure out if you actually did them or not, right? So currently, they have 2,800 companies that have signed up for this, and they've got a range of different things. So you either sign up for a well below 2 degrees pathway, or you sign up for a 1.5, which is even more stringent. That means that if you're in sector X, let's say manufacturing of automobiles, you have to follow a certain path towards decarbonization that involves X% reduction in your carbon emissions, right? And so that's what it does. What the SVTI did very well in the beginning, it established a strong credibility and said no offsetting. And maybe I'll talk about that later. But they've now created a new standard called the Net Zero Science-Based Target, which incorporates offsetting of emissions, but in a more responsible way. So let me talk about that when I come to the next page, which is how do you decarbonize, right? What are the key levers to decarbonize for these companies? So the first one is that you measure your footprint and then you start reducing your footprint. So you look at your scope 1, scope 2, scope 3 emissions. Scope 1 is what you're directly emitting through your actions. You're burning, a certain amount of fossil fuel, or you have refrigerants, or you're running buildings, or whatever it might be. The second scope is indirect purchase of electricity. And then the third scope is your suppliers' emissions that you are encouraging as a result of purchasing from them, etc. So it's 3 levels removed from your direct actions. So the first thing you can do is reduce, but then the second thing you can do is also offset, which means that you invest in activity or you sponsor activities that allow others to reduce carbon or to remove it or to avoid carbon generation. So this is typically a lot of this is nature-based solutions. NBS, as some of you may have heard, there's a lot of activity around forestry, for example, and the measurement and sponsorship of forestry activities. Offsets are controversial or have been controversial because they should not be seen as a license to continue doing what you're doing. And that was the argument of the SVTI initiative, that this is being used by companies to continue doing their activities. And what's happening is in the environment, the carbon is coming out anyway. So how do we prevent that from from coming out? And you first have to reduce, and only then you can offset. So there's a hierarchy of decarbonization, as you can see on the right-hand side of the V chart, that says first, thing to do is to eliminate through design. You know, it's kind of very similar to the recycling, the 3 R's of recycling, right? You first reduce before you start, you know, creating new stuff. You first start to eliminate through design, and things like if you're a chocolate factory which is using low-grade heat, you know, to cook cocoa and you know, milk together to create chocolate. Do you really need to boil up your steam to 100 degrees and then cool it down to 35 in order to create low-grade heat? Because that's what's happening right now, right, in a lot of these factories. And so you really need to find ways. Maybe there's ways to actually reduce heat by reusing a lot of the heat that's being generated through waste heat, whatever that is already sufficient to cook that chocolate, for example. The second is reduce through efficiency. So again, if I use the same example of the chocolate factory, you know, can I actually replace the boiler with a heat pump? Because the heat pump is actually using, you know, again, not it's a better way of utilizing energy because it's not reaching those high levels. It's taking cool from the atmosphere and making a chemical reaction and changing it to the right level of heat, for example. But these investments cost money, and that's what, you know, and so you really have to be able to find a business case for these investments. Then the third is around substitution. So if I am using energy in all my processes, right, if I'm smelting or if I'm cooking or if I'm running a fleet of vehicles, etc., then how do I use cleaner sources of energy rather than the dirty sources of energy? So that's the third. And then finally, you compensate through offsets. If you've done everything you possibly can, then you compensate through offsets. I think the issue with offsets, the issue with especially nature-based offsets is a very high level, is that if everybody said, I want to offset, we'd only be able to decarbonize by about 30%. So there's not enough opportunity to offset. So what we need to do to tackle this problem is to literally throw everything at it, right? So we have to do the reductions and we have to do the offsetting. And that's why that hierarchy is so important. Moving to the next slide, I just want to give an example of, companies that are sort of ahead in the game. And I think Microsoft was one of those that made an announcement around becoming carbon negative by 2030. But they've also committed to remove all carbon from the environment by 2050 that they ever created since they were founded in 1975. So what is really interesting, what I like about the way that Microsoft has done this is that they're actually very open about reporting what they're doing. So you can just find all the initiatives that they're taking on their website. And they've got a clear, as you can see on the right-hand side, like a clear path towards what their emissions are like, what their emissions across the supply chain are like, how they plan to reduce that, and if they can't reduce it, then how do they offset it? What types of projects, removal projects or avoidance projects, etc. I want to, looking at a quick time check here, I think I have only about 2-3 minutes left. I just want to end by saying that, as I mentioned, this is a complex problem, and it's not, the private sector in its current form is not geared to be solving these global problems on its own. And there are a lot of challenges that are faced. And I work a lot across various sectors. I work with the mining sector, I work with the tech sector, I work with manufacturing, I work with real estate, etc. And the complexity often lies in the first problem, which is hard to find a business case and to secure funding. I mean, that is rapidly changing now in the last 2 years. But before that, it was hard to find a business case for making these types of investments, right? So the one I talked about, and how you're going to switch from a boiler to a heat pump, for example, very simple example. How do you justify an investment that takes 5-6 years to pay off? That was hard. And frankly, it leads to the second problem, which is hard to find the right type of technology. I mean, that technology is proven, but there are other technologies that are not proven. I've been working in this sector for 20 years, and 12 years ago, solar was way more expensive than the grid. And about 10 years ago, what happened, I think it was 2012 or so, the prices crashed and solar started to become really, really cheap. China stepped in, started making panels, etc. And now we have solar, which is in most parts of the world cheaper than the grid, right? So, but nobody could anticipate that 10 years ago. And so would you have made an investment in this technology, not knowing that it's going to be 1/10 the price or whatever it is now? So that's the challenge. And now it's the same thing with green hydrogen, for example. We're working on green hydrogen, we're working on carbon capture, we're working on green methanol, we're working on ammonia, we're working on green fleet, battery operated fleet, etc. How do you know when the price is going to come down to a level that you can make bets, and is it the role of the private sector? So there's a lot of consortium kind of activity that's happening to simplify and to, reduce risks. The third issue is it's hard to operate in immature markets with unclear regulation. And I see that a lot here in Southeast Asia, where it's still not clear how you can purchase green power, for example. Just to give you an example, green PPA, PPAs is basically how deregulated is your power market? And can you actually create private sector agreements and purchase green energy, even if you're willing to do that? That itself is complicated when the regulation is changing really rapidly. And currently around here, a lot of the regulation is being formulated and changing. And so it's a little bit hard for companies to place bets. And then also to add, on top of that, the carbon price is changing rapidly as well. And every new global force at the Ukraine war, the carbon prices started falling and nobody understood why. And it's now starting to rise back again. So the carbon price has fluctuated dramatically in the last 2 years. It's risen like crazy, then started to fall, then it's rising again, etc. So it's also complicated to take those factors into account when you're doing business planning. And then there's a couple of other issues, like for example, hard to implement change across the supply chain. So if you're, FMCGs, if you're a fast-moving consumer goods company, how, most FMCG companies, a lot of the leading companies are starting to take action, but a lot of them don't know what's happening with their tier 2 suppliers or with their tier 3 suppliers. And very quickly, you reach a level in the supply chain where you are working with a smallholder farmer, or you're working with a small factory that is still operating with paper and pen. So you don't have, you don't have the privilege of asking them, hey, can you improve your technology and the ways you operate, and let me know how you're reducing your carbon emissions, because they're not exactly capturing their carbon footprint. So that's another complication. And then finally, I think that the last two. The last one is cultural transformation and convincing people. I think this is a global problem. However, different countries with different levels of income, have different views of the importance of this issue, and I think that leads to a lot of cultural debate around, who should be taking responsibility, how should we be going about this, etc. And then finally, it's hard to access data. It's, all this is easier said than done. It's very hard to be able to measure, and I talked about those standards. It's hard and complex to measure carbon emissions in the first place. So those are some of the challenges that the private sector faces. And I just wanted to end with that. So just maybe a quick recap of, the fact that this is a highly complex problem. And, initially it was in the realm of more in the sort of the development sector and, Europe that was leading this conversation. It's now become being recognized globally, and a lot more actions taking place from all quarters, which is really amazing. Challenges remain, but we are hopefully working through those challenges. And I think just to finally say that as a parent, for me, I think it's really important that we kind of leave, do the right thing. We're on the right side of history. So I personally really invest in making sure that we come out of this with some level of success. Thanks a lot. And thanks again to UWC.
Thank you so much, Malavika. That was a wonderful presentation. Congratulations.
Thanks, Saima.
I think your points about offsetting carbon generation and how there's a lack of opportunities really struck with me. And I think there's a lot of stimulation, and there might be lots of questions. I have not had any raised hands here, but may I please take this opportunity to remind everybody, all of the participants, that there's an online networking that's been specifically set for this purpose. So that can be reached at going into the session page of in the agenda page, where you probably saw Malavika's session name and everything. So there's an icon. If you press that icon, it'll take you to the online networking. It'll ask you to join. So please join the button, and you can see Malavika and myself there.
Thanks, Saima. I'll be signing off here so I can.
Yes, signing off here too.
Bye.
Thank you, everyone. Bye. Have a nice evening, everybody. Bye.